The UK is open for business, according to Immigration Minister Mark Harper, as changes to UK immigration rules will give greater flexibility to business visitors and companies sponsoring international migrants. Here to speak to us more on the UK's immigration rules is Sophie Barrett-Brown from Devine Solicitors. Sophie, how is the UK developing its immigration rules?
There's been something of a negative trend really in immigration over the last couple of years, very much a tightening up and putting in place barriers really to UK businesses. However, following that, there have been some very positive changes, particularly in relation to Tier 2 of the points-based system, creating some practical changes that will assist employers.
Well, in that context, how welcoming would you say the UK is to EU and, in fact, non-EU immigrants?
The UK is certainly very welcoming to visitors per se, but it has presented itself somewhat negatively in relation to those who are coming to the UK for longer periods. And really there's been a very negative impression given to business over the last couple of years. So for example, if we go back a few years, companies who needed to bring in workers from their own business units overseas as intra-company transferees, those workers were able to come to the UK. They could be extended as many times as necessary. And ultimately, if they were here for long enough, they could potentially apply for indefinite leave to remain. Restrictions were brought in to prevent them from being able to apply for indefinite leave to remain and to prevent them from continuing to extend. So you could have a senior level executive who's here for 5 years and is compelled to leave the UK. Positive developments that have occurred in relation to that are that depending on the level of earnings of that worker, they can continue to extend for up to 9 years, and the magic figure is £152,100.
So what's the major changes that are proposed for the UK business immigration rules?
The major changes relate to the new Immigration Act that has just been put before Parliament, and that has far more concerning implications, including in particular the removal of appeal rights for many groups in the UK. And we certainly see a broad range of applications that are decided incorrectly, and it's very important that the appeal systems exist to correct those errors and provide a remedy for migrants and the businesses that employ them.
Well, when it comes to immigration laws, what are the biggest challenges that employers face?
Coming to the points-based system to Tier 2, which is the main route that employers will use, Tier 2 is very complicated at times for employers to understand. As lawyers, we're dealing with these issues day in, day out, and even then it requires a great deal of time to keep on top of the constant changes in policy and the law. And one of the difficulties with immigration is so much can change simply through policy. Whilst we have an Immigration Act that's been laid before Parliament, many of the changes in immigration happen almost overnight with rule changes or policy documents being produced. So keeping up to date is a real challenge. And the nature of Tier 2 is one that in a sense catches them after the event. So under the old work permit scheme going back some years, if they wanted to employ a migrant worker, they would be making an application to the Home Office, and it would either be successful or not successful. But if unsuccessful, the employer hadn't done anything wrong. Whereas Tier 2 really requires the employer to be making their own assessment. It's a little like a self-certification scheme. They are checking that the job meets the requirements of the scheme, that the worker meets the requirements of the scheme, that they've carried out all of the actions that they're required to, that they've retained all the documentation that they're required to, and that once the worker is employed in the business, that they continue to update their records as they must to notify the Home Office of any changes. And so the opportunities for errors to have been made and to only be detected after the event, even with an employer who has the best of intentions, is quite high.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the UK immigration system is quite complicated. Now, what does this mean for the UK? Does that mean a lot more investment is perhaps going to Europe?
Anecdotally, that's absolutely something that we have encountered. In terms of inward investment, there are some businesses who take the view that it's too cumbersome in the UK to be able to engage the migrant workers that they need. And there may be other European countries that are offering easier solutions. But of course, companies don't tend to just look at immigration, they look at everything in the round, and there may be tax drivers, there may be employment law drivers. So I think the UK still does reasonably well, but we certainly do see companies who choose to set up elsewhere, and immigration is one of the factors that they have taken into account.
What industries in the UK are most reliant on immigrants?
I'd say that immigration affects the full range of industries, but there certainly are some that recent reports have shown rely more heavily. Interestingly, actually, the financial sector, by many of the reports that have been produced in recent years, is shown to be a sector that relies enormously on migrant labour, and very much at the skilled end of that market.
Well, how would you say curbing EU immigration could affect then the British economy?
As a member state of the EU, free movement is an absolute fundamental principle of that. If, however, EU migration was restricted, that would clearly have a very significant impact on the many thousands of British businesses who employ EU and non-EU workers. And there's always obviously concerns around reciprocal responses. So if the UK pulls up the drawbridge and other countries do the same, the UK's ability to trade in other countries and to post its workers in other countries is also affected as well.
Finally, when it comes to companies employing migrants for the first time, are there any certain tips you have or a checklist that they should go through when they're approaching this?
All employers must check all workers, whether they're a foreign national or a British citizen national that they're engaging, and carry out right to work checks. And there are specific documents that they need to check when they're doing that. And we do often see errors that employers make where they haven't seen the correct documents, or they haven't seen them at the right time, or often they haven't taken the right type of copies of those documents. The most common example that we see is there's a need to take a copy of the passport, whatever nationality that person may be, and it's logical to assume that that would be the page in the passport that shows their immigration status. But it's actually also a requirement to copy the outside cover of the passport, and that's one of the practical things that we see missing all the time.
Sophie, thank you so much.
My pleasure.